In the quiet town of Havenswood, Maryland, life for the Roberts family had always been predictable. Lewis Roberts, a dedicated father and a mechanical engineer, was the rock of the household. His two children, Anna and James, adored him, and his wife, Sandra, trusted him implicitly. But everything changed when Lewis began acting strangely. It started small, a few offhanded comments about being watched, glances over his shoulder, and a refusal to discuss certain topics. Then it escalated. He would stay up all night, claiming he could hear whispers through the walls. The family initially thought it was stress, but when he started accusing Sandra of being in on it with some unnamed conspirators, they realized it was more than that. A psychiatrist diagnosed him with schizophrenia, and his mental health quickly declined. Lewis became withdrawn and paranoid, convinced the FBI was following him. His life, once centered around his family, began revolving around a shadowy world he created in his mind. He distanced himself from his old friends and instead surrounded himself with an odd assortment of people, drifters, addicts, and the kind of characters Sandra had never seen before. They came and went from their home like phantoms, leaving behind a trail of unease. One evening, Lewis left for work and didn't return. Sandra wasn't immediately alarmed. Cell phones were a luxury at the time, and occasional delays at work weren't unusual. However, when hours turned into an entire night, dread crept in. She called Lewis's workplace first thing in the morning, hoping for a simple explanation. He left at his usual time, the manager told her, seemed fine when he walked out. Sandra's next calls were to family and friends, but no one had seen or heard from him. By nightfall, her worry transformed into panic. She contacted the police and explained the situation. Her husband, mentally unwell, had vanished without taking anything other than his wallet and car. At first, the authorities weren't particularly concerned. Adults went missing all the time, they said. But Sandra's insistence finally convinced them to file a missing persons report. 2 weeks later, Lewis's car was found abandoned in the parking lot of a shopping center in New Jersey, over 200 miles away. The vehicle yielded no clues. No further leads emerged. Detectives suspected foul play but had no evidence to pursue. The case faded into the background, buried under the weight of newer, more urgent crimes. Sandra and her children tried to move on, though the absence of answers haunted them. By the time James turned 25, his father's disappearance had become a grim but distant memory. James was in college, living off campus with friends in a rented house 6 hours from Havenswood. His life was consumed by classes, parties, and the occasional weekend trip home. One afternoon, while James was in class, 2 men knocked on the door of his house. His roommate, Alex, answered. The men were disheveled, middle-aged, and wearing mismatched, ill-fitting clothes. Their politeness seemed forced, their smiles uneasy. "Is James Roberts here?" one of them asked, his voice overly friendly. Alex frowned. "He's not home right now. Can I take a message?" The men exchanged glances. "We're old friends of his father," the second man said. "We just need to speak with him. Can you tell us when he'll be back?" Alex hesitated. Something about their demeanor felt wrong. "Do you have a phone number or something he can call you at?" The men dodged the question, instead asking if James still drove the car with Maryland plates parked in the driveway. They wanted to know where James was, how long he'd been living there, and if he could be reached on his cell phone. By now, Alex's unease had turned into full-blown suspicion. "I think you should leave," he said, his tone firm. "If you don't, I'm calling the cops." The men didn't argue. They simply turned and walked away, disappearing down the street. When James returned home and Alex told him what had happened, he immediately called the police. The incident was reported to the local department, which forwarded the details to Havenswood, where Lewis's case file still gathered dust. A sketch artist worked with Alex to create composite drawings of the 2 men, but no one recognized them. The detective in charge of the case, a grizzled veteran named Harris, speculated that the men might be tied to Lewis's disappearance. "People don't just show up asking about a man who's been missing for 15 years without a reason," Harris told James. The encounter dredged up old memories and unanswered questions. James couldn't stop wondering, were the men looking for Lewis, or did they believe James knew something about his father's whereabouts? The timing was strange, given how long it had been since the disappearance. 8 more years passed, and James never saw the men again. But the encounter left him with a lingering sense of unease. Why had they sought him out so far from home? Why ask about a car that no longer existed, sold off years earlier? Now, 23 years since Lewis Roberts vanished, the family still lives with the shadow of his absence. Sandra often wonders if he's still alive somewhere, trapped by his mental illness or worse. James, now in his 30s, sometimes dreams of his father walking back into their lives, but deep down, he knows the truth may remain a mystery forever. Some questions aren't meant to be answered. In the summer of 1988, the Harding family's life took a dark and mysterious turn. William Harding, a charming yet unreliable man in his early 40s, had always been a source of tension for his ex-wife, Linda, and their 3 sons. His sporadic visits to their East Texas home were often tied to his financial state. When he was flush with cash, he'd shower his boys with gifts, only to vanish for months when the money dried up. William worked as a shuttle driver for a local hotel, a job he often dismissed as a cover for something far more thrilling. He boasted to his sons about working for powerful people, claiming he ferried fugitives and criminals under the radar. His stories were colorful and extravagant, filled with mentions of secret drop-offs and coded messages. The boys didn't take him seriously, dismissing his tales as another layer of his habitual exaggeration. But everything changed when William disappeared. It was a quiet afternoon when Linda received a call from her middle son, David, who worked at a local Dairy Queen. His voice was tense. "Mom, have you heard from Dad?" "No, not in months." "Why?" David hesitated. "2 men came into the store today. They asked about him, wanted to know if I'd seen him lately. I told them I hadn't, but they didn't seem like friends." Linda's chest tightened. "Did they say who they were?" "No," David replied, "but they were intense, like they were trying to intimidate me. They left when I said I didn't know anything, but it felt wrong." The conversation left Linda uneasy. William's long absences were normal, but strangers asking about him was not. The unease turned to dread the next day when David called again. "They came back," he said, his voice shaky. "This time they said they were FBI agents. They had badges, but they weren't like the ones you see on TV. They were cheap-looking. They demanded I tell them where Dad was. I kept saying I didn't know, but they wouldn't let up. Mom, they were angry, like they were blaming me for not knowing." Linda tried to reassure him, but her own nerves were fraying. She called the hotel where William worked, hoping for clarity. The manager's voice was curt. "Mr. Harding hasn't been here in weeks. We assumed he quit. Is there a problem?" "Yes," Linda replied, her voice trembling. "There's a big problem." The following evening, David returned to his apartment to find the sliding glass door ajar and his belongings ransacked. He called his mother in a panic. "They didn't take much," he said, "but what they took, it's weird. They took my address book, a photo of my son, and the teddy bear I keep for him here. Why those things? What are they trying to tell me?" Linda was furious and terrified. The next morning, she, David, and her eldest son, Michael, went to the local FBI office to report the harassment. The agent who greeted them looked puzzled. "We haven't assigned anyone to investigate your husband," he said, "and none of our agents would behave like that. If they came to your son's workplace and home, they weren't FBI." When Linda mentioned William's claims about working for organized crime, the agent's face betrayed no emotion. "We can't confirm or deny anything about that hotel," he said. "But if these men were impersonating federal agents, that's a serious matter." Linda wasn't the only one piecing things together. Michael, the eldest Harding son, remembered a strange event from a few weeks earlier. Working as a late-night radio DJ, he was driving home around 3:30 a.m. when a car appeared out of nowhere and began tailgating him aggressively. "I couldn't see the driver," Michael recalled later. "The car had its high beams on, blinding me. I tried switching lanes, but they followed me. When I turned, they turned. It was like they were hurting me somewhere." Michael managed to lose the car by weaving through a neighborhood and pulling into a gas station, but as he ran inside, the car drove past, its lights flashing briefly. For the first time, Michael got a good look. It was a tan four-door sedan with two men inside. "I thought it was just punks messing with me," he admitted. "But now, I'm not so sure." When he shared the story with Linda and David, everything clicked. The car he had been driving that night once belonged to William. If these men were looking for their father, they might have mistaken Michael for him. After weeks of fear and paranoia, a detective from the local police department finally provided some answers. He contacted Linda to say that William had been tracked down, alive, but hiding. "Your husband owes over $50,000 in gambling debts," the detective explained. "He's been working odd jobs in Nevada to stay under the radar." Linda was stunned. "And the men who harassed my son? Who broke into his apartment?" "They were probably bounty hunters or debt collectors," the detective replied. "It's not uncommon for people like that to impersonate federal agents to intimidate families. As for how they got into the apartment, sliding glass doors aren't hard to open if you know what you're doing." The detective also revealed that William had listed David's address and phone number as his own on a job application. That explained why the men targeted him instead of Linda or Michael. Weeks later, William returned to East Texas as if nothing had happened. He offered no explanation, no apology, and no acknowledgement of the chaos his debts had caused. Linda and her sons chose not to press him for answers. They were just relieved the ordeal was over. But the mystery lingered. Who were the men chasing him? What exactly had William been involved in, and how much of his outlandish stories had been true? For Linda and her children, some questions would remain unanswered forever. It was a warm spring afternoon in 1997 when Caroline Brewer, a 32-year-old mother of three, found herself stranded in an unfamiliar town. She had driven her two youngest children, ages 1 and 3, to a pediatrician's appointment at a newly built clinic on the outskirts of Monroe, Georgia. The clinic, surrounded by stretches of empty fields and isolated roads, was a modern but lonely outpost. After their checkup, Caroline loaded her sleepy children into their car seats and started the engine of her black Jeep Cherokee. But instead of the reassuring hum of the motor, she heard only a rhythmic clicking noise. She tried again and then again. The engine refused to turn over. Her heart sank. The clinic was now closing, and the parking lot, once filled with patients' vehicles, was almost empty. Caroline waved at the receptionist as she locked the doors and explained her predicament. The woman allowed her to use the office phone, and Caroline flipped through the phone book until she found a local garage. Returning to her Jeep, Caroline prepared herself for a long wait. She rolled down the windows to let in some air and rummaged through the diaper bag for snacks and a bottle to keep her children calm. The receptionist and other staff drove away one by one, leaving the parking lot completely empty. About 20 minutes later, a battered pickup truck pulled into the lot. Caroline assumed it was the mechanic, though the truck lacked any company logos or identifying signs. A middle-aged man climbed out, dressed in oil-stained overalls and a faded baseball cap. He smiled, waved, and approached her vehicle. "You called for help?" he asked, his southern drawl thick and casual. "Yes, thank you so much for coming," Caroline replied, relief washing over her. The man nodded, then walked to the front of the Jeep and lifted the hood. As he poked around, he muttered something about a loose wire. Caroline stayed in the driver's seat, keeping an eye on her kids in the rearview mirror. "You should come out here," the man called. "I can show you the wire. It's a simple fix, but you'll want to know how to handle it if it happens again." Caroline hesitated. "Oh, I'm not much of a car person," she replied, forcing a polite laugh. "I'll just wait until you're done." The man frowned but didn't press the issue. For several more minutes, he appeared to tinker with the engine, occasionally glancing toward Caroline. As the sun dipped closer to the horizon, Caroline began to feel uneasy. The man wasn't moving with the urgency one might expect from a mechanic. Instead, he seemed to be stalling, his motions slow and deliberate. "You sure you don't want to see this?" he asked again. "Just a quick look." "No, thank you," Caroline said, trying to keep her voice steady. The man sighed, straightened up, and leaned slightly toward the open window. "You know," he said, "I'd hate for you and the kids to get stuck like this again. You really should learn how to fix this yourself." His tone was friendly enough, but something in his expression made Caroline's stomach churn. She gave him a tight smile and stayed firmly in her seat, one hand on the keys, the other gripping the wheel. Then, headlights illuminated the parking lot as another vehicle pulled in. A large, unmarked truck came to a stop a few spaces away. The man under the hood froze. Without a word, he slammed the hood shut, jogged back to his pickup, and sped away. Caroline was startled by his sudden departure, but had little time to dwell on it. The driver of the new truck stepped out and approached her Jeep. "Ma'am, I'm from Monroe Auto Services. You called about a stalled car?" Relief flooded through her. "Yes. I thought the other guy was you." The mechanic, a bearded man in his 50s, frowned. "What other guy?" Caroline explained what had happened. The mechanic listened, his expression growing more serious. "Did he touch the engine?" he asked. "I think so," she said. He nodded grimly, opened the hood, and began inspecting the engine. A moment later, he stepped back, holding something in his hand. "Ma'am, is this yours?" Caroline squinted at the object. It was a long, rusty blade, resembling a cross between a dagger and a pair of oversized scissors. The edges gleamed as if they'd been recently sharpened. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "What is that?" The mechanic studied the blade with a disturbed look. "It was sitting on top of your engine. It wasn't hidden. It was placed there." Caroline's blood ran cold. The mechanic carefully set the blade on the curb. "Whoever that guy was, he wasn't trying to fix your car," he said quietly. "I don't know what he was planning, but I'm glad I got here when I did." Caroline could barely process his words. She hurriedly paid the man, who advised her to contact the police as soon as she got home. He offered to dispose of the blade, but she asked him to place it in her trunk, thinking it might be useful for an investigation. That night, Caroline contacted the police and described the incident. The officer on the phone seemed indifferent. "Sounds like an old pair of surgical shears," he said casually. "Probably nothing to worry about." Frustrated, Caroline tried to emphasize the danger she and her children had faced, but the officer's disinterest was clear. He suggested she hold on to the blade in case someone followed up, but implied they likely wouldn't. Caroline stored the strange object in her garage for years, wrapped in newspaper and shoved in a corner. When her family moved to another state, she reluctantly threw it away, not wanting the reminder of that terrifying day. Years later, Caroline learned about a string of disappearances in Georgia around the same time, some involving women who had gone missing in rural areas. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had narrowly avoided becoming one of them. To this day, she wonders what the strange man was planning and whether the real mechanic's arrival saved her life. She has never forgotten the cold, sinking realization that her instincts had almost failed her, or the sound of that truck pulling into the lot at just the right moment. Sometimes survival is a matter of luck. In the summer of 2006, The hiking trails of Mount Robson in British Columbia were alive with activity. A group of eager tourists had gathered for a guided trek up the now-closed summit trail, an arduous but rewarding journey offering breathtaking views of the Canadian Rockies. Among the hikers was 53-year-old Evelyn Baker, an experienced mountaineer who had made the trip to celebrate her recent retirement. Unbeknownst to her, the hike that began as a personal milestone would soon turn into one of the strangest unsolved mysteries in the region's history. 2 groups, 1 trail. The tour guide, a man named Connor, decided to split the hikers into 2 groups. Group A, for the faster hikers, and Group B, for those who preferred a more leisurely pace. Evelyn, competitive by nature, joined Group A, which included some of the guide's most seasoned participants. The 2 groups were equipped with walkie-talkies for communication, with the plan being that both would rendezvous at the summit by noon. Connor assured everyone that the trail was straightforward. There was only one way up and one way down. At approximately 10:30 a.m., Evelyn and her group were nearing the summit when she slipped on a mossy rock, twisting her ankle. She assured her group she would be fine, but Connor insisted on staying behind with her until Group B caught up with their first aid kit. The rest of Group A continued onward, eager to reach the peak and maintain their fastest group reputation. The atmospheric anomaly. While waiting for Group B, Evelyn and Connor noticed something strange. The air, which had been crisp and cool, suddenly became stiflingly warm. A heat wave seemed to envelop them, raising the temperature by nearly 15 degrees Celsius. "I thought it was just the sun breaking through the clouds," Evelyn later recounted. "But it didn't feel natural. It was too sudden, too intense." Connor checked the walkie-talkie and contacted the rest of Group A, who reported that they were close to the summit and experiencing the same phenomenon. Moments later, a low rumble echoed through the air. It sounded like distant thunder, yet the sky was clear and cloudless. When Group B finally arrived, the heat and rumbling had dissipated. Evelyn, eager to complete the hike despite her injury, joined the slower group as they continued upward. When Group B reached the summit, they expected to find Group A waiting for them, enjoying the panoramic view. Instead, they found only an eerie silence. Connor and Evelyn scanned the area. The footprints of Group A were clearly visible in the dirt, leading all the way to the summit, but there were no tracks indicating they had descended. No backpacks, no stray water bottles, no signs of a struggle, nothing. It was as if the group had simply vanished into thin air. The walkie-talkies were useless. Connor tried contacting Group A repeatedly, but no one responded. With daylight fading, he made the difficult decision to lead Group B back down the trail and report the incident. Authorities launched a massive search operation, scouring the mountain for days. Helicopters flew over the area, drones mapped the terrain, and rescue teams combed through every inch of the summit and its surroundings. Yet no trace of Group A was ever found. One particularly chilling detail emerged during the investigation. Witnesses in nearby towns reported hearing the same rumbling sound that Evelyn described. Some claimed to have felt vibrations in the ground, while others reported a fleeting but intense wave of heat. Meteorologists dismissed these accounts, attributing the phenomena to glitches in weather monitoring equipment. However, locals insisted that something unusual had happened that day. As Evelyn recounted her experience in the weeks following the disappearance, she began to notice odd parallels with another strange mystery: the human feet that had been washing ashore along British Columbia's coast. Starting in the late 2000s, over 20 dismembered feet, most of them left feet, were discovered in hiking boots or sneakers. At first, Evelyn dismissed any connection between the two events. After all, Mount Robson was far inland, miles from the Pacific Ocean. But one detail made her pause. Connor, the guide for Group A, had been wearing neon green hiking socks that day. The same kind of socks were found on one of the dismembered feet that washed ashore years later. Evelyn refused to discuss the incident further. When pressed for details, she would fall silent, her eyes distant and haunted. The once vivacious woman became a shadow of herself, withdrawing from her social circles and abandoning her love of hiking. The disappearance of Group A remains one of the most baffling unsolved mysteries in Canadian history. No remains were ever found, and theories abound. Some believe the hikers were victims of a freak geological event, such as a sinkhole or landslide, though no evidence supports this. Others speculate about a government cover-up, extraterrestrial interference, or even time slips. To this day, Evelyn Baker avoids Mount Robson, but the memory of that hike and the rumble that seemed to shake the very air follows her like a shadow. Sometimes, the most terrifying mysteries are the ones that leave no answers, only questions.